The survey station had one shower, and it was in the instrument shed. I know how that sounds. 12 years on a hydrological posting, 12 years at the same low stone building beside the same slow river, and nobody ever got around to plumbing the residential annex properly. There was always something more urgent, a sensor array to recalibrate, a flood season to document, a funding review that delayed infrastructure requisitions until the next cycle, and then the one after that. The shower was in the instrument shed because that was where the water line ran when the original builders put the station together, and that was where it stayed. A curtain on a ring, a drain in the floor, 6 meters from the current velocity rack and the sediment core storage unit. 12 years. You stopped noticing. I had been on the river for 4 days. The upper watershed survey ran longer than expected, a silt deposit at the Kelorvath tributary confluence that needed 3 extra days of manual core sampling. I came back to the station in the dark, unloaded the survey raft, filed the preliminary data, and slept 8 hours. In the morning, I went to the instrument shed to shower. The door was ajar. I noticed that before I went in. The instrument shed door had a self-closing mechanism, and I was meticulous about the self-closing mechanism because the humidity on this corridor moon was constant, and instrument corrosion was a real and documented problem. The door being ajar meant something was wrong. I stopped in the threshold. I could see them from there. 2 small figures, both asleep, curled together on the spare survey blankets I kept folded in the lower cabinet below the current velocity rack. The blankets had been pulled down carefully, not thrown, not dragged. Someone had found them and arranged them with consideration. The figures were small enough that both fit on a single folded blanket with room to spare. The second blanket pulled over them unevenly but thoroughly, tucked in at the edges with what I could only describe as deliberate attention. I stood in the threshold for a moment. I am a hydrological survey technician. I have spent 12 years measuring things, which means I have spent 12 years learning to observe before I act. I observed. The larger one, ash lavender skin, close-cropped silver pale hair, pointed ears pressed flat against the blanket. She was breathing steadily. Her eyes were closed, but there was a faint line between her brows, even in sleep. The specific tension of someone who had been responsible for something for a long time and could not fully let it go even when unconscious. Her clothing was damp at the hem. River water. The smaller one, mint silver skin, hair the color of pale copper, a shade I hadn't seen before on any Velorath child, and I had processed enough welfare documentation in 12 years to have seen the range. She was tucked inside the larger child's arm with the completeness of a small creature that had found exactly the right-sized shelter and had no intention of moving. Her face was turned toward the blanket's edge, one hand curled beside her chin. They had crossed the river on my survey raft. I went back outside and checked. The raft was tied at the dock, not my knot, but a functional one, which meant the larger child had learned her knots somewhere or figured them out from looking at mine. The raft had been crossed from the eastern bank. The eastern bank was not part of my survey territory. The eastern bank was where the Velketh secondary corridor ran. I went back to the instrument shed threshold and considered what I was doing. I needed to shower. I had 4 days of river work on me. The instrument shed had the only shower on the station. The instrument shed had 2 sleeping children in it. These were the facts. I was still standing there when the larger child opened her eyes. She didn't move. That was the first thing I noticed. She came awake the way an animal comes awake in a place it isn't certain of, with her eyes open and her body still, cataloging before committing to anything. She found me in the threshold. We looked at each other. I said in trade language, "Good morning." Her eyes were double iris, pale gold inner ring, deeper amber outer, and they were doing something very precise. She was reading me. I let her. When you are measuring something, you do not rush the measurement. After a moment she said, in trade language with a careful accent that told me she had learned it formally rather than in use, "Good morning. We should not be here." No, I agreed. But you are. She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, my sister is still asleep. I see that. She does not sleep easily. I looked at the smaller child, still folded into the larger one's arm with that completeness, the pale copper hair against the blanket edge. She seems to be managing, I said. Something in the larger child's face shifted, small as a current direction change in still water, but I had 12 years of reading still water. She said, yes. I said I need to use the shed, but there's no urgency. I glanced at the sky beyond the door. The survey logs can wait an hour. I'll start the data transfer and come back. She said, we will go. You don't have to. She said it again more quietly, we will go, not defiance. Something else, a practiced saying of the thing that was expected of her. She had said it before, to other people, in other thresholds. I said the data transfer takes 40 minutes. The grain paste is in the residential annex, second cabinet from the left. You're welcome to it. I looked at the smaller child again. Let her sleep. I went to the annex. I ran the data transfer. I filed the sediment core preliminary and opened the welfare provision index. I kept a copy on the station relay because out here the response times from the corridor authority were long, and I had learned over 12 years that the provisions you need are the ones you read before you need them. I found Article 14. I read the subsections I hadn't needed yet. At 40 minutes, I went back to the instrument shed. The larger child was sitting on the lower cabinet, upright, watching the smaller child still sleep. The spare survey blanket was refolded neatly beside her. She had replaced it on the cabinet without being asked, which told me something. She had grain paste in a field cup. She looked up when I came in. Your sister still asleep? I asked. Yes, she paused. I didn't eat the grain paste until she woke up. She ate first. I said, I see you found the cups. Third shelf, she said. I looked. The smaller child was awake now, sitting up in the blanket with the careful attention of someone orienting to a new space. She looked at me with pale gold double iris eyes that were doing the same cataloging the older one had done, but faster. She arrived at her conclusions more quickly, which meant she had had more practice trusting her first reads. She looked at the grain paste cup in her sister's hand. Then she looked at me. I said, there's more in the annex. She said, in trade language with a fluency that outpaced her sister's careful formality by a considerable margin. You haven't showered. No. You came back from the river. 4 days ago. She looked at me with those double iris eyes and said, with the flat precision of a child stating an observable fact, that is a long time not to shower. The older sister made a soft sound that might, in other circumstances, have been the beginning of a reprimand. I said, it is. The smaller child said, we are in the shower shed. You are. She looked around at the instrument shed, the current velocity rack, the sediment core storage, the curtain on its ring, the drain in the floor. She looked back at me. She said, this is the only shower. On the station, yes. She considered this with the gravity it deserved. Then she said, we will go outside. You're welcome to stay. You need to shower. I do, but the sediment cores also need processing, and that's another 2 hours minimum, so there's time. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, in the trade language but with a Velorath word embedded in it that I recognized as the word for a specific kind of person, not one with a translation I could recover from memory, but one that carried warmth in the way she said it. Your river is very slow. It is, I said. It's a good river for sediment mapping. Slow water carries more. She nodded as though this confirmed something. Then she pulled the blanket off her lap with the specific efficiency of a child who has learned to manage her own comfort without expecting anyone to manage it for her, stood up, folded it once with a fold that mirrored her sister's care, and set it on the cabinet. We'll go outside, she said. Shower, we will wait. I said, the dock is nice in the morning. Mind the east board, it's soft. She said, I know, I tied the raft there. I looked at her. She looked back with those double iris eyes, not challenging, just accurate. That was you, I said. My sister told me the knot. I tied it. She glanced at the older one with something in her face that was complicated and brief and had years in it. She tells me things. They went outside, I showered. 4 days of river work. The smell of mineral sediment and the particular vegetative note the upstream marsh gave to everything downstream from it. All of it washing down the drain in the instrument shed floor. I dressed in the shed. I kept clothes on the hook behind the curtain, a standard habit, and went back outside to find them both on the dock, sitting with their feet over the edge, watching the river. I sat down beside them, leaving space. We sat in the morning quiet. The river was slow and brown with suspended sediment and smelled like the marsh upstream. The humidity was, as always, complete. A survey bird worked the shallows on the far bank with methodical disinterest. The smaller child said without preamble, we left because they were coming. I said, who? The men in gray. She said it the same way she had said everything factually, without drama. They came to our house 2 days ago. They said we belonged to them. I said, under what provision? She looked at me sideways. You know provisions. I've lived on this corridor for 12 years. I've learned. The older child said quietly, Section 44. Her trade language was more careful than her sister's, each word placed with attention. Our house dissolved when our father died. They said we were unregistered secondary transit assets. They had a paper. I said, a commercial transit claim instrument. Yes. Under the dissolved house registration. Yes. I said, when did they file it? The older child looked at me. The younger one looked at the river, her feet swinging slightly above the water. The older one said, 2 days ago. They said they would return in 60 hours to execute. I did the arithmetic. 2 days ago meant the window had approximately 36 hours remaining. I said, how did you cross to the eastern bank? We walked, the older child said. Our house was in the Velketh secondary corridor. We walked east for 1 day and found the river. We found the raft. She paused. I'm sorry about the raft. The raft is fine, I said. You tied it back. Wren tied it back, she said. And there was something in how she said her sister's name, not possessive, not proud exactly, but something adjacent to both. The particular tenderness of someone who has been responsible for a thing so long that the thing's competence has become one of the fixed truths of their world. I said, I'm Wren Vale, survey technician, Station 4. The older child said, Sail. Then, after a pause, Sail Velorath Korath. The smaller child said, without looking up from the river, Wren, I'm Wren. You have the same name as me almost. Almost, I agreed. 1 letter. She nodded as though this was satisfying. Then she said, will you help us? It was not quite a question. It was something between a question and a statement of what she had already assessed was likely. She was 7 years old, approximately, and she had read me in the time it took me to walk from the annex to the instrument shed threshold and back, and she had arrived at her conclusion and was now giving me the opportunity to confirm it. I said yes. She nodded again once and went back to watching the river. I went inside and filed the Article 14 welfare hold at 8:41. I listed both children by name, both approximate ages, the dissolved house registration reference, and the Section 44 commercial transit claim instrument as the named threat. I filed it under my compact survey technician registration as the responsible adult party. I sent copies to the Corridor Authority Welfare Office, the Bilateral Welfare Board, and the compact secondary relay at the Junction Hub. Then I made more grain paste and brought it out to the dock. We ate. The survey bird was still working the far bank. The humidity sat on everything the way it always did, a soft, persistent wait. Sale ate carefully, portioning her paste with the attention of someone who had learned not to assume there would be more. Wren ate quickly and thoroughly, and looked at the grain paste pot with the frank assessment of someone calculating whether asking for more was within the bounds of what was acceptable. I said, "There's more." She said, "I know, I saw the cabinet." She paused. I was deciding if it was polite to ask. "It's polite," I said. She held out her cup. I refilled it. Sale watched this exchange with the same complicated brevity I had seen in the instrument shed, years compressed into a fraction of a second. She ate another spoonful of her own paste and said nothing. I had been on this corridor for 12 years. I had processed welfare documentation in that time, not often, but the eastern bank of this river was the Velketh secondary boundary, and things crossed from that boundary sometimes, adults mostly, occasionally children, and I had learned the provisions. I knew what a commercial transit claim instrument looked like and what it was meant to do. It was meant to classify. It was meant to put a category on a thing and move the thing along a designated track before anyone with the relevant provisions in their head had time to look up the right counterargument. The counterargument for a commercial transit claim instrument under a dissolved house registration was Article 14, which I had now filed, and Article 27 subsection 3, which stated that unregistered secondary transit assets could only be classified as such if they were demonstrably non-sapient or demonstrably incapable of independent welfare determination. I had observed Sale read me in 30 seconds from a position of complete exhaustion. I had observed Wren calculate the politeness threshold for a second serving of grain paste. Neither of these was a non-sapient or welfare-incapable entity. I filed the Article 27 challenge at 9:12. At 10:34, I got a relay from the Corridor Authority Welfare Office acknowledging the Article 14 hold. At 11:52, I got a relay from the Bilateral Welfare Board acknowledging the Article 27 challenge and noting that a response would be issued within the standard review period of 14 days, which was longer than the 36-hour execution window by a considerable margin. That was expected. What mattered was that the filings were time-stamped, which meant the execution window was now legally suspended pending review. I had learned that from the provisions. I sent a relay to the Velketh Secondary Holdings Coordinator at 12:03, citing both filings and the suspension of the execution window and requesting acknowledgement. I did not receive acknowledgement by end of day. That was also expected. In the afternoon, I showed Sale the sediment core processing procedure because she asked. She had been watching me work at the analysis table in the instrument shed. She had come in quietly, taken a position near the door where she was not in the way, and watched with the specific focused attention of someone filing information for later use rather than casual observation. I explained the procedure. She listened. She asked 2 questions, both of which indicated she had been tracking the procedure's logic rather than just its surface steps. I answered them. She nodded. Wren spent the afternoon on the dock. I could see her through the instrument shed window. She had found the survey measurement cards I kept in the dock box, waterproofed field cards with graduated measurement markings, and she was holding them at the water's edge and reading the river's surface. She was doing it systematically, working from the dock's near edge to the farthest reach of her arm, moving in increments that mirrored the measurement card intervals. I watched her for a while. She was doing informal current velocity assessment from surface pattern observation. It was not precise, but it was not random either. It was a methodology. At 17:03, I got a relay from the Velketh Secondary Holdings Coordinator. It was not an acknowledgement. It was a counterfiling. They had amended the commercial transit claim instrument to add a supplementary provision under Section 44 subsection 9, which covered welfare dependents of dissolved houses in compact adjacent territory. The theory was that crossing the river had constituted entry into compact adjacent territory and reset the classification clock, voiding my Article 14 hold on a jurisdictional technicality. I read the counterfiling twice. Then I read Section 44 subsection 9. Then I read the Compact Velkith Bilateral Territory Accord, which was available on the station relay in full because I had downloaded it 3 years ago after a similar, smaller incident with a Velorath adult who had crossed on a raft. The Bilateral Territory Accord had a provision in its Annex 4, paragraph 11, that specifically addressed river crossings and jurisdictional continuity. River crossings in survey-designated waterways did not constitute territorial entry for the purposes of classification resets, because survey-designated waterways were managed by the Compact Survey Authority and were therefore compact jurisdictional space from bank to bank. My river was a survey-designated waterway. It had been designated as such for 41 years. I filed the Annex 4 paragraph 11 counter-challenge at 1748. Sale was still in the instrument shed. She had been working her way through the sediment core log at the analysis table, not touching anything, reading. She looked up when I filed the counter-challenge. She had been close enough to hear the relay exchange. She said, "Did it work?" "The challenge is filed," I said. "It takes time." She said, "How much time?" "Less than they have on the execution window, if I did it right." She looked at me with those double-iris eyes. "Did you?" "I think so," I said. "I downloaded the Bilateral Territory Accord 3 years ago." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You prepared for this." "I prepared for something like this," I said. "Not for you specifically, but the eastern bank is the Velkith secondary boundary, and I learned a long time ago that you read what might come across a boundary before it crosses." She looked at the sediment core log in front of her for a moment. Then she said, "Our father said something like that." I didn't say anything. She had offered it and I did not want to pull at it. She said, after a moment, "He said the only time you are certain of water is when you have measured it. Otherwise you are guessing." I said he knew survey work. "No," she said, "he was talking about something else." She looked at the sediment log. "But it sounds like what you just said." Wren appeared in the instrument shed door. She had the measurement cards in her hand, still damp from the river. She looked at me and said, "The current is faster near the eastern bank than near the dock, by about 1/3. I said, "That's right. The channel shifts east at the lower bend. The western shelf is shallow." She nodded. "I thought so." The surface texture was different. She came in and laid the measurement cards on the edge of the analysis table with precise edges aligned. I didn't know if the difference was current or depth. "Both," I said. "They're related here." She nodded again. Then she said, "Did you fix the paper problem?" "Working on it." She said, "Good," with the same flat accuracy she applied to everything, and pulled out a station stool and sat down to help her sister with the sediment log. That was the first evening. I made dinner in the annex, standard survey ration, supplemented with the preserved root vegetables I kept for the long seasons when resupply was slow. The annex kitchen was small and functional. 1 burner, a storage cabinet, a narrow table with 2 chairs that I had never needed a second chair at before today. I pulled a crate from the supply corner and set it beside the table for a 3rd seat. Wren sat on the crate without comment, assessed its stability with a brief side-to-side test, and decided it was acceptable. Sale took the chair nearest the door, which told me something. She sat where she could see the exit, and I filed it away without making anything of it. Wren ate everything on her plate and looked at Sale's to see if she was going to finish. Sale noted the look and ate the last portion of her root vegetable without comment. Wren nodded, unsurprised. At 22:03, the Velkith Secondary Holdings Coordinator sent a second relay. They had filed a motion contesting my Annex 4 paragraph 11 counter-challenge, on the grounds that the children had not arrived by a survey-authorized crossing, and therefore the survey waterway designation did not apply to their transit. The argument was that the survey waterway designation covered survey operations, not civilian crossings. I read the motion. Then I read Annex 4 paragraph 11 again, and the paragraph before it and the paragraph after it. Paragraph 10 established that the designation covered the waterway in full, without qualification as to the nature of transit, because the Compact Survey Authority had legal maintenance responsibility for the waterway's banks, and therefore for any person or object within the designated boundaries. Paragraph 12 specified that any dispute about the designation's application was subject to Compact Survey Authority adjudication, not Bilateral Holdings Authority adjudication. I was the Compact Survey Authority for this waterway. I was the sole survey technician at Station 4. I filed a paragraph 12 adjudication decision at 2231, ruling that the designation applied to the children's crossing under paragraph 10's unqualified coverage clause, and that the Bilateral Holdings Authority had no jurisdictional standing to contest the ruling under paragraph 12. I copied the filing to the Corridor Authority Welfare Office, the Bilateral Welfare Board, the Compact Survey Regional Office, and the Velketh Secondary Holdings Coordinator. Then I went to bed. In the morning, the second morning, I found both children on the dock again. The survey bird was back on the far bank. The river was the same slow brown it always was. Wren had the measurement cards again. I made grain paste and brought it out. We ate on the dock. The humidity was, as always, complete. Sale said, "You filed last night." I did. Late. The filing had a time window. She looked at the river. "You didn't have to do this." "The provision was there," I said. "Provisions are only useful if someone uses them." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "When our father was alive, he filed provisions for our house. He was good at reading the instruments." She paused. "When he died, there was no one to file." I said, "How long ago?" 4 months. She said it the way you say a number you have said so many times it has lost some of its weight, which means it has not lost all of it. The house dissolved in 2 months. The instrument, the paper, came 2 months after that. Wren said, still looking at her measurement cards, "I miss him." Sale said quietly, "Yes." They were both quiet. The survey bird worked the shallows. The river carried its slow brown sediment. I said, "The adjudication filing should hold the execution window until the Bilateral Welfare Board completes its review. That's 14 days. Long enough for a full challenge." Sale said, "Will the challenge succeed?" "The Section 44 subsection 9 argument fails under Article 27, I said. "I've filed the counter. The adjudication ruling closes the jurisdictional challenge. The main instrument, the commercial transit claim, relies on the dissolved house registration as its basis for classification. Article 27 subsection 3 requires a determination of non-sapient or welfare-incapable status before the classification can hold. That determination requires a formal assessment." Sale said, "They haven't done an assessment." "No," I said. "They filed the instrument without one. That's standard for these instruments. They're designed to move fast before anyone can file the counter provisions. But the absence of the assessment is the instrument's structural weakness. Without the assessment, the classification is void under subsection 3. Wren said, "We are obviously sapient." "Demonstrably so," I agreed. She said, "I have been doing current velocity assessment since yesterday." "You have?" She held up the measurement cards. "I have 7 data points. That's a reasonable preliminary data set for informal surface pattern observation." She set the cards down with the precise edge alignment again. "I will write them up." I said, "I'll show you the format." Sale looked at me. She had that line between her brows again, the one that didn't fully smooth even when she was relatively at ease. She said, "Why are you doing this?" I said, "Doing what?" "The river," she said. "The measurement cards, the format." She was precise about it, not ungrateful, just measuring, the way I measured things. I said, because it's what's in front of me to do. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she said, our father used to say that. I said, what? That the work in front of you is the work, she said, not the work you planned. I said, he sounds like he was a good survey technician. He was a transit scheduler, she said, but yes. The line between her brows softened very slightly. He was. On the second afternoon, a relay came from the Corridor Authority Welfare Office. They had reviewed the Article 14 hold and the subsequent filings and had issued a preliminary determination. The welfare hold was valid. The execution window was suspended pending the Bilateral Welfare Board's full review, and the children were to remain in their current location under the care of the Registered Responsible Adult Party. I was the Registered Responsible Adult Party. I told Sale and Wren at dinner. Sale received the information with the same precise stillness she received everything. Wren received it by eating her dinner with slightly more speed than usual, which I had learned was her version of satisfaction. 14 days, Wren said. For the board's review, yes. And then the instrument should be voided, I said. The assessment gap is fatal to the classification, but after that, there's the question of what comes next. Sale said, what do you mean? I said, Article 14 covers welfare holds for children in immediate threat. Once the instrument is voided, the hold transitions to a welfare placement review. The review asks where you go. Sale said, we don't have anywhere. I know, I said, that's what the review addresses. Wren said, could we stay here? I had been thinking about that since the first morning on the dock. I said, that's one of the options the review considers. Wren looked at Sale. Sale looked at the table. There was something between them in the look, something that had been built over years of being responsible for each other, a language that didn't need words. Then Sale looked at me. She said, would you want that? I said, yes. She nodded once, the way Wren nodded, a single deliberate confirmation. She went back to her dinner. On the third morning, the Velketh Secondary Holdings coordinator arrived in person. I saw the crawler on the eastern bank at 7:12. It had crossed at the upper ford, a shallow crossing 2 kilometers upstream that was technically in compact adjacent territory under a different subclause of the bilateral accord, which meant they had done their reading too. 3 figures got out. The coordinator in a gray Secondary Authority transit coat, 2 operatives in field gear. They could not cross the river without my permission. That was Annex 4, Paragraph 10. The survey waterway designation covered both banks within 50 meters of the water line. They were standing on my bank. I went to the dock. Sale and Wren were already there. Wren had her measurement cards. Sale was watching the far bank with the still careful attention she applied to everything. She said without looking at me, they came. Yes. What do you need to do? Talk to them, I said. You two stay on the dock. Wren said, I can hear from here. You can, I said. The coordinator called across the water. He had a relay amplifier. His voice carried clearly over the river's slow sound. He said he was there to execute the commercial transit claim instrument, and that the Bilateral Welfare Board's review did not constitute a final determination, and that the Article 14 hold had been filed by an unauthorized party. Survey technicians were not welfare officers, and therefore was procedurally invalid. I had my own relay amplifier. I called back across the water. I cited Article 14's definition of an authorized filing party, which included any registered compact employee with direct knowledge of a welfare threat. I was a registered compact employee. I had direct knowledge of the welfare threat. The filing was valid. He cited Paragraph 7 of the Compact Internal Administrative Code, which stated that welfare filings by non-welfare designated employees were subject to confirmation by a registered welfare officer within 24 hours. I cited the time on my confirmation relay from the Corridor Authority Welfare Office. Confirmation had been received at 14:03 on the first day. That was within 24 hours of my 8:41 filing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he cited the jurisdictional argument again, that my paragraph 12 adjudication ruling was self-interested and therefore invalid. I cited the Compact Survey Regional Office Confirmation Relay, which had come in overnight and which I had been waiting for him to make this argument so I could use. The regional office had reviewed the paragraph 12 ruling and confirmed it under the Survey Authority's standard adjudication protocol. The ruling was not self-interested. It was the authorized exercise of the Compact Survey Authority's jurisdictional power over a designated waterway. He was quiet for longer this time. I could see him at his relay unit, conferring with the operatives. Sale was behind me on the dock. I could feel her attention on my back, the specific quality of someone who is tracking every word being said. The coordinator said, "We will be pursuing the Welfare Board review." "That's your right," I said. "The board will review the Article 27 challenge. The absence of a sapience and welfare capacity assessment will be a significant issue for the instrument." He said, "That assessment can be filed retroactively." "It can be requested," I said. "The retroactive filing provision requires demonstration that the assessment opportunity was available at the time of the original instrument and was not used. Given that the children were living in their house in the Velketh secondary corridor for 2 months after dissolution before your instrument was filed, the demonstration of available opportunity will be straightforward." I paused. "I'm happy to provide the dates of residence if it would help." He did not respond to that. He said they would be in contact through the standard relay channels. I said I looked forward to it. The crawler left. I turned around. Sale was 2 meters behind me, exactly where I had left her. Wren was 3 meters behind Sale, measurement cards in her hand. They were both looking at me. Wren said, "The current is the same as yesterday." I said, "Good to know." She looked at her cards. "I think the channel is stable." "It usually is at this time of year," I said. "The flood season is 6 weeks out." She nodded, then she said, "You were very calm." "I had the provisions." Sale said, "People don't usually use the provisions." "No," I agreed, "but they're there." Sale said, "Why did you learn them?" I said, "Because the eastern bank is the Velketh secondary boundary, and I didn't like what I saw crossing that boundary in the first 4 years. I looked at the far bank, empty now, the ford 2 kilometers upstream invisible from here. Not much I could do in the first 4 years. I learned what I could have done, and I did it in the 4th year when the next thing crossed, and I kept learning." Sale said, "What crossed in the 4th year?" "An adult. Different situation, same instrument, different provisions." I paused. She got to where she was going. Sale was quiet. The line between her brows was there again, and this time it had something additional in it, not tension, not quite. Something that was the beginning of trust, or the recognition that trust was a possibility. She said, "You've been doing this for 12 years. The survey work, yes. The provision reading, 8 years. She said, "You do the survey work and the provision reading. They're both about measuring what's in front of you," I said. She looked at the river for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, not to me but not quite to herself either, "That is what he meant." I didn't ask. She had offered it and I received it without pulling at it, the way you receive a current velocity reading. You note it, you let it mean what it means. The Bilateral Welfare Board issued its interim ruling on Day 7 of the 14-day review period. The Section 44 subsection 9 argument was rejected under Annex 4 paragraph 10, as I had expected. The Article 27 challenge was upheld. The commercial transit claim instrument was procedurally deficient for failure to obtain a sapience and welfare capacity assessment prior to filing. The instrument was suspended pending a formal assessment, which the board's ruling specified must be conducted by a registered compact welfare assessor. The welfare assessor arrived on day 9. She was a woman named Vel Korath, 40 years in the welfare division, who arrived in a standard compact administrative shuttle and spent 30 minutes with each child separately in the instrument shed, which I had vacated for the purpose, and then 30 minutes reviewing my station documentation and my 8 years of provision filings, and then 20 minutes talking to me on the dock. She said they're demonstrably sapient. That wasn't in question. I said no. She said the instrument was filed without any good faith basis for the classification. That's not an accident. She was looking at the river. It's a pattern. I said I know. She said I'll be flagging it in the assessment report. The board will take note. She paused. The instrument will be voided. The classification will be struck. She looked at me. Then we get to the placement review. I said yes. She said, you filed the preliminary residential registration yesterday morning under the Survey Authority residential provision. Survey technicians at remote postings are eligible for extended family residential registration, I said. The provision covers dependents where there is no viable alternative placement and the posting environment is appropriate for child welfare. I paused. I've been at this posting for 12 years. The environment review was completed on day 3. Vel Korath looked at me for a moment. She had the eyes of someone who had spent 40 years observing and had long since stopped being surprised by what humans did and hadn't started taking it for granted either. She said, you prepared the residential file in advance. I prepared it in parallel with the welfare hold, I said. I didn't want to file it until the instrument challenge was further along, but the environmental review needed to be in early. She said, why? I said, because Sale is 10 and has been the responsible party for herself and her sister for 4 months without adequate support, and Ren is 7 and has been doing informal hydrological observation since the second day she was here. And this is a survey station. It is a reasonable place for a 10-year-old who reads provisions and a 7-year-old who reads rivers. I paused. There was more to it than that, and Vel Korath had 40 years of reading people and would know there was more to it than that, so I said it. Sale found an anomaly in my sediment core log, month 7 going back. I missed it. She found it in 2 days. I looked at the river. And Ren has been sitting on that dock for 8 mornings with field cards doing current velocity observation with informal methodology that is getting more precise each day. By day 5 she had added a second observation point. By day 7 she was noting cloud cover variables. I looked back at Vel Korath. This is a survey station. Those are survey skills. I didn't teach them those. They came with those. Vel Korath looked at me. She said, and you want to not waste that. I want to not waste them, I said. There's a difference. She was quiet again, looking at the river with the expression of someone who has seen many things and is deciding how to categorize this one. Then she said, the residential registration will require a formal welfare review board approval. That's 3 weeks. I know, I said. The Article 14 hold covers the interim period. She nodded. She went back inside to complete the assessment documentation. I went to find Sale and Ren. They were in the instrument shed. Sale was back at the sediment core log. She had worked her way through the last 4 months of data and had found an anomaly in the upper watershed readings that I had missed, a gradual shift in the silt composition that suggested an upstream source change. Ren was at the analysis table beside her with a field card and a stylus, writing up her 7-day current velocity dataset in the format I had shown her. I said the assessment went well. Sale looked up. She was thorough. She usually is, I said. Ren said, without looking up from the field card. I told her about the channel shift. What channel shift? The current difference between the eastern bank and the dock. I have 8 days of data now. The differential is consistent. She finished a notation and looked up. She said it was interesting. I told her you would want the data. I said, I do want the data. She handed me the field card. 8 days of current velocity readings, informal methodology, surface pattern observation, consistent increment intervals. The methodology had improved day over day. By day 5, she had added a second observation point. By day 7, she was noting cloud cover conditions as a variable. By day 8, she had begun sketching the surface pattern shape rather than just noting the number. I read it twice. I said, this is good work. She said, I know. She said it the same way she said everything, without vanity and without false modesty, just accuracy. I want to do the formal methodology next. With the actual instruments. I said, 3 weeks before the board review. That's enough time, she said. Sale said quietly, Ren. Ren said, what? Sale said, you're planning to stay. Ren said, yes. She said it the way she said the current was faster near the eastern bank, as a fact she had assessed and arrived at through observation. He filed things. He went to the dock and talked across the water. He gave me the measurement cards. She looked at her field card in my hand. He read my data. Sale was quiet for a moment. The line between her brows was still there, but different. Not the tension of responsibility, not the preparedness of a child ready to leave, but something else. She said to me, is it true, the residential registration? I said, filed on day 3. Board review in 3 weeks. She said, and you want this? I said, Sale, I spent 8 years reading provisions against the possibility that something would come across that river. Something did, 2 somethings. I looked at her. I don't do things I don't want to do. She looked at me for a long time, with the same reading attention she had used in the instrument shed threshold on the first morning. A full assessment. Then she said, the sediment anomaly in the upper watershed reading, month 7 going back. The silt composition is shifting toward coarser grain. She turned back to the log. Something changed upstream. I said, I didn't catch that. You were on the river for 4 days, she said. You had other data to process. I said, do you want to do the upstream survey next month? She was quiet for a moment, then she said yes. It was not a large word. It did not sound large, but it had in it something I had not heard in the instrument shed on the first morning, or on the dock in the second morning, or in any of the filing and counterfiling and relay exchanges of the days between. It had in it the specific quality of a 10-year-old who had been the responsible party for too long deciding, carefully and deliberately, to let someone else carry some of it. I said, we'll plan it for the 2nd week after the board review. She nodded once and went back to the sediment log. Ren said, without looking up from a new field card she had already started, the upstream survey will take more than 4 days. Probably 6, I said. Will we come? If the board approves the residential registration. She said, they will. She made a notation. I have been doing informal hydrological observation for 8 days. By next month I will have better methodology. She looked up at me with those double-iris pale gold eyes. That is relevant to the survey. It is, I said. She nodded and went back to her field card. The board approved the residential registration 22 days later, 1 day before their deadline. The approval came with a notation from the review committee citing the children's documented adjustment to the survey environment, the existing Article 14 welfare hold record, and the 8-year record of provision filings by the registered responsible adult party as factors supporting the placement determination. Vel Korath had included the current velocity dataset in the supporting documentation. The committee's notation mentioned it specifically. Sale received the relay with the same precise stillness she received everything. She read it twice and set it down and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "It was the data set." "Partly," I said. "Wren's data set." I said, "Your anomaly finding helped too." She was quiet again. Then she said quietly, "He would have been glad." I said, "Your father." "He would have liked this," she said. "The water, the provisions." She looked at the river through the instrument shed window, the measurement. I said, "You can tell me about him, if you want." She said, "Later," not a refusal, a deferral, the careful economy of someone who has learned that some things need their own time. There is a lot to tell. "We have time," I said. She looked at the river for a moment longer. Then she said, "I know." Outside on the dock, I could hear Wren. She was narrating her current velocity readings to herself, aloud, in the precise methodical cadence of someone who has found the format that suits her and is using it thoroughly. The survey bird was back on the far bank. The humidity was complete and constant. The river was slow and brown and carried its sediment the way it always had, patient and accumulating, taking the longest route around every obstacle because the longest route was the one that moved the most. Sale picked up the sediment core log and turned to month 7. I sat down across the table from her and picked up my own copy. "We worked,"